Something just happened that no mainstream outlet wants you to sit with long enough to actually understand. Trump, the man who built his entire political identity on dominating Mexico, on tariffs, on walls, on America first, just blinked, and not quietly. The United States, the self declared leader of the free world, walked back its position on Mexico in a way that every geopolitical analyst paying attention recognized immediately as a structural retreat, not a negotiation win, not a strategic pause, a retreat. But here's what they're burying underneath the headline: China and Russia didn't just watch this happen, they moved swiftly, deliberately, the kind of move you only make when you've been waiting, when you already had the chess piece in your hand before the board even shifted. This isn't about Trump and Mexico anymore. This is about what the world's rising powers just learned about American leverage and how fast they're prepared to exploit that lesson. Because when the most powerful nation on earth shows the world where its pressure points are, its rivals don't file that away. They act on it immediately. What you're witnessing right now isn't a news cycle, it's a realignment. Let's go back to the beginning of this. Because if you don't understand the foundation, you won't understand the collapse. When Donald Trump came back into office, he came back with what his team described as maximum pressure diplomacy. The idea was simple on the surface: use the enormous economic weight of the United States, use tariffs as a weapon, use trade dependency as leverage, and force smaller nations into compliance. Mexico was supposed to be the showcase. Mexico was supposed to be the proof that this strategy worked, and for a brief moment it looked like it might. The rhetoric was fierce, the deadlines were real, the tariff threats were specific, and the American media, across the political spectrum, was treating this like a masterclass in hardball negotiation. But something happened on the way to that victory lap, something that the people celebrating in the early days didn't see coming, or more accurately, something they saw coming and chose to ignore. Mexico didn't fold the way the model predicted. And that's the part nobody wants to talk about with the kind of seriousness it deserves. Because when you build an entire foreign policy architecture on the assumption that economic pressure alone is enough to bend sovereign nations to your will, and then the first major test of that architecture produces a result that looks nothing like submission, you have a problem. Not just a political problem, not just an optics problem, a structural problem, a problem with the theory itself. And what Trump's team did in response to that problem is exactly what you'd expect from an administration that is more committed to the appearance of strength than the substance of it. They reframed the retreat as a win. They moved the goalposts. They changed the language. They called a capitulation a deal. And they hoped that the American public, drowning in a media environment that moves faster than human attention can track, wouldn't notice the difference between what was promised and what was delivered. But here's the thing about geopolitics that makes it fundamentally different from domestic politics. In domestic politics, perception can substitute for reality for a very long time. You can tell people the economy is great while their grocery bills are climbing, and if you're skilled enough at messaging, you can maintain that fiction for years. But in geopolitics, there are other players at the table, players who don't care about your domestic narrative, players who are not watching your press conferences for reassurance, players who are watching your actions, measuring your resolve, testing your commitments, and drawing very cold, very calculated conclusions about what you will and won't actually do when the pressure gets real. And two of those players, the two most consequential ones on the planet right now, just drew a conclusion about American power that should make every serious person in this country deeply uncomfortable. China watched this. I want you to understand how carefully China watches American foreign policy, because it's one of the most underappreciated dynamics in global politics today. Beijing has an entire analytical infrastructure devoted to understanding American decision making. They study American political cycles. They study the gap between American rhetoric and American action. They study the domestic constraints that shape what American presidents can and cannot actually do, regardless of what they say. And what China saw in the Mexico situation was not a bilateral trade dispute. What China saw was a data point, a very valuable data point about the current administration's pressure threshold, about how long the United States can sustain economic pain before it looks for an exit, about how easily the framing of a retreat can be dressed up as something else when the domestic audience is not paying close enough attention. That's what they saw. And you need to understand that in Beijing's strategic calculus, that kind of information is more valuable than almost anything else, because China is currently navigating its own set of pressure points with the United States, the technology war, the semiconductor restrictions, the Taiwan question, the South China Sea, the relationship with American allies in the Pacific. All of these are ongoing pressure campaigns that the United States is running against China's rise. And for all of those campaigns to work, China has to believe that the United States will absorb significant pain in pursuit of its strategic objectives. China has to believe that when America draws a line, that line means something, that there's a cost to crossing it that America is genuinely prepared to impose and sustain. The Mexico situation just provided China with real-world evidence that this belief may be misplaced, not theoretical evidence, not analytical speculation, actual observed behavior by the current American administration when faced with resistance and domestic economic discomfort. That's a gift, a genuinely significant strategic gift, and Beijing is not going to waste it. Now let's talk about Russia, because Russia's response to all of this is operating on a slightly different logic, but heading toward the same conclusion. Russia under Putin has always operated on a very specific theory of American power. Putin believes, and has believed for decades, that the United States is a declining empire that is still living off the credibility it accumulated during the Cold War era, without doing the structural work necessary to maintain that credibility in a genuinely multipolar world. He believes that American power is increasingly theatrical, that it depends on allies believing in it more than it depends on actual hard capacity. And every time the United States does something that confirms this theory, Putin gets more confident, more aggressive, and more willing to push into spaces that a genuinely powerful America would have successfully defended. The retreat on Mexico is exactly the kind of thing that feeds Putin's model, because it's not about Mexico at all to him. It's about pattern recognition. It's about watching the most powerful country in the world get into a confrontation, feel the economic and political pushback, and find a way to step back while calling it something else. That pattern to Putin is a green light. Not necessarily for any specific action right now, but a green light for continued pressure, for continued probing, for continued testing of where the actual lines are, as opposed to where the stated lines are. And this brings us to something that I think is genuinely underappreciated in the American public conversation about foreign policy, which is the difference between stated commitments and credible commitments. A stated commitment is when you say you will do something. A credible commitment is when other nations actually believe you will do it based on their observation of your behavior over time. The United States has spent decades building credible commitments. The entire NATO alliance is built on credible commitments. The security guarantees to South Korea and Japan are credible commitments. The defense of Taiwan, ambiguous as it officially is, functions as a credible commitment in practice. These commitments work not because America has a signed contract to honor them, but because America has historically demonstrated the willingness to follow through when challenged. Every time the United States fails to follow through when challenged, every time it retreats from a stated position under pressure, it erodes the credibility of all its other commitments simultaneously. This is not a metaphor. This is how deterrence actually functions in international relations. And what happened with Mexico in this broader context is not a small thing. It's another chip taken out of the foundation of American credibility at a moment when that foundation is already under serious stress. Let me bring this to the economic dimension, because the economic piece of this story is where things get really important for ordinary American people. The tariff strategy was sold to the American public as a tool of national strength, a way to force trading partners to give America better deals, a way to bring manufacturing back, a way to assert American economic dominance in a world that had, in the administration's telling, been taking advantage of American openness for decades. And there's a real conversation to be had about all of that. There are legitimate grievances embedded in that narrative. American workers have genuinely suffered from decades of trade arrangements that prioritized corporate profit over domestic employment. There are real structural problems in the American economy that trade policy has contributed to. I'm not dismissing all of that, but the tariff as weapons strategy depends on something very specific to work. It depends on the country deploying the tariffs being more willing to absorb pain than the country receiving them. And this is where the Mexico situation exposes a fundamental miscalculation, because the American economy and the Mexican economy are not actually as separate as the rhetoric implied. They are deeply structurally integrated in ways that took decades to build, and that cannot be undone by executive order without causing serious damage on the American side of the border as well. American consumers were already feeling the effects. American businesses with supply chains running through Mexico were already feeling the effects. American agricultural producers who depend on Mexican markets were already feeling the effects. And when those constituencies started pushing back, when the domestic economic pain started registering in ways that were politically uncomfortable, the calculation changed. Not because Mexico suddenly became more powerful, but because the domestic political cost of holding the line exceeded the threshold that the administration was willing to absorb. Mexico understood this, and to Mexico's credit, they waited. They applied counterpressure. They made noise in all the right places, and they watched the American position erode from the inside. That's not Mexican strength overpowering American strength. That's a fundamentally flawed strategy colliding with the reality it was designed to ignore. Now, I want to talk about what this means for the broader global economic order, because we are living through a genuinely historic transition in how the world is organized economically, and most Americans are not getting the full picture of what's happening. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency has been the cornerstone of American economic power since the end of World War II. It's what allows the United States to run enormous deficits without the consequences that any other country would face. It's what gives American sanctions their bite. It's what makes American financial markets the center of global capital. And for decades, this arrangement was so deeply entrenched that challenging it seemed almost absurd. But something has been shifting, slowly at first, and then with increasing speed and deliberateness. Countries around the world, not just adversaries, but countries that have historically been American partners, are quietly, methodically reducing their exposure to dollar-denominated systems. They're building alternative payment infrastructure. They're settling bilateral trade in local currencies. They're accumulating gold instead of treasury bonds. They're doing all of this because they have watched American economic policy become increasingly weaponized, and they have concluded that the systemic risk of being dependent on the dollar is no longer worth the convenience. The Mexico situation accelerates this trend in a way that's not immediately visible, but is very real. Every time the United States deploys economic pressure and then retreats without achieving its stated objectives, it sends two messages simultaneously. The first message is that the pressure is survivable, that if you can hold on long enough, if you can absorb the pain and wait for the domestic American political situation to shift, you can come out the other side without having fundamentally changed your behavior. The second message is that being economically integrated with the United States is a liability as much as it is an asset, because that integration gives Washington the ability to threaten your economy whenever a political dispute arises, regardless of whether you're in the right or whether the dispute is actually about economics. Both of those messages push countries toward the same response, which is to gradually, carefully, and strategically reduce their dependence on American economic systems. And this is exactly what China has been facilitating and encouraging for years through the Belt and Road Initiative, through the expansion of BRICS, through the development of alternative financial infrastructure. The Mexico situation just gave that project more momentum. Let's talk about the moral dimension of this, because I think it gets lost in the purely strategic analysis, and it shouldn't. There is a question of what kind of country the United States wants to be in the world. And I'm not talking about this in a naive, idealistic way. I'm talking about it in a hard-headed, strategic way, because the United States has historically derived enormous power from something that pure military and economic capacity cannot fully explain. It has derived power from being seen, at least by a significant portion of the world, as a country that stands for something beyond its own narrow interests. A country that, whatever its failures and hypocrisies, and there have been many, was at least committed in principle to certain values: the rule of law, the protection of smaller nations from domination by larger ones, the idea that international disputes should be resolved through negotiation and institution rather than through pure coercion. These ideas, when America lived up to them, even partially, created what international relations scholars call soft power. The ability to shape other countries' preferences and behavior, not through threats, but through attraction, through the appeal of the model itself. That soft power has been eroding for a long time, for reasons that go beyond any single administration. But the current approach to foreign policy, which is so nakedly transactional, so openly contemptuous of the institutions and norms that America itself built, so willing to use economic coercion against allies and trading partners without the kind of consistent follow-through that would at least make it strategically coherent, is accelerating that erosion dramatically. And when soft power erodes, hard power has to work harder to achieve the same results. More pressure is needed to get the same compliance. More force is required to maintain the same influence. And there are real limits to how much hard power can substitute for soft power before the entire system becomes unsustainable. We are not there yet, but the direction is not ambiguous. What does this mean for the American worker, the American family, the ordinary person in this country who is trying to understand what's actually happening and why it matters to their life? Because I think this is the part that often gets lost in geopolitical analysis, which tends to operate at a very high level of abstraction. The truth is that America's position in the world has very direct material consequences for American living standards. The dollar's reserve status keeps inflation lower than it would otherwise be. The network of alliances keeps American military costs distributed in ways that would be far more expensive if America had to provide all of its own security unilaterally. The trading relationships that America has built over decades provide American consumers with access to goods at prices that reflect global competition rather than purely domestic production costs. None of this is free. All of it involves trade-offs and costs. But the alternative, an America that has burned its alliances, eroded its credibility, retreated from its international commitments, and found itself facing a coordinated block of rivals who have concluded that American power is more theatrical than real, is not a cheaper America. It's a much more expensive and much more vulnerable America. And this is what makes the current moment so critical, because the decisions being made right now, the patterns being established right now, the signals being sent right now to Beijing, to Moscow, to every capital in the world that is watching American behavior and drawing conclusions about what it means. These things are not easily reversible. Credibility, once lost, takes years and sometimes decades to rebuild. Alliances, once damaged, carry scars that change their functionality even after formal repair. The international order, which is genuinely being reorganized right now in ways that will define the next several decades, will reflect the choices that are being made in this window. And right now, the choices being made are sending a very specific set of signals. They're telling the world that American commitments have a lower threshold than previously advertised. That American economic pressure, while painful, is survivable with enough patience. That the space for a genuinely multipolar world with China and Russia playing much larger roles is expanding. None of this is inevitable. None of this is irreversible yet. But the window for course correction is not unlimited, and it is currently being consumed at a rate that should concern anyone who cares about where this country ends up. There's one more dimension to this that I want to address, and it's the most uncomfortable one, which is the domestic political economy of all of this. Because why is this happening? Why is an administration that came in with a maximalist foreign policy agenda retreating on Mexico? Why is the approach to China and Russia producing outcomes that those countries are visibly treating as victories? The answer, at least in significant part, is that the American political economy, the structure of interests, incentives, and institutions that shapes what American policy can actually do, is itself deeply dysfunctional. The United States is a country in which the interests of working people and the interests of concentrated capital have been increasingly separated, in which the political system has become so polarized that long-term strategic thinking is almost impossible, in which every major policy decision is evaluated primarily through the lens of its short-term domestic political impact rather than its long-term strategic effect. This is not a problem that one election or one administration creates or solves. It's a structural problem, a problem that has been building for decades, a problem that is rooted in the choices made about how to organize the American economy, who benefits from growth, who absorbs the costs of dislocation, and who has the power to shape the policy response. And until that structural problem is addressed, until the United States rebuilds an economy that actually serves the broad majority of its population, that gives ordinary people a real stake in the system and a real reason to support the long-term investments that maintaining American power requires, the foreign policy is going to keep running into the same wall, because you cannot sustain an assertive, credible, long-term foreign policy on the back of a domestic economy and a domestic polity that is this divided, this anxious, and this short term in its orientation. China understands this, Russia understands this, most serious analysts around the world understand this. The question is whether enough Americans understand it to demand something different, not just a different face delivering the same broken approach, but a genuinely different way of thinking about what American power is, where it comes from, what it requires, and what it's actually for. Because the real story of what just happened with Mexico isn't about Mexico. It's about us. It's about what kind of country we're choosing to be. It's about whether we're going to keep mistaking the theater of strength for strength itself, or whether we're finally going to do the harder, less glamorous, more necessary work of building the real thing. That work starts with telling the truth about what actually happened. And that's exactly what we just did.